in the year 2002, a gentleman by the name of Newman, and I don't recall his first name, wrote an article asking the question, what is anti-Semitism, or words to that effect? And everyone, he said, was taking it very seriously because the Western world is rampant with anti-Semitism. And this is what he replied. I take a different view. I think we should almost never take anti-Semitism seriously, and maybe we should have some fun with it. And I agree with Mr. Newman, because 98% of what the Western world calls anti-Semitism ain't anti-Semitism.
Is that Albert Eaton?
To talk about what we aren't going to talk about today, we're going to be talking about mud, lies, and streams. And it's really quite important. There are at least 5 different kinds of mud. I had intended, and if this were a larger group and if I'd had the appropriate time, I would have come with a bowl of wet dirt, and I would have come with some of the sludge that's at the bottom of my coffee maker. I would have come with some diluted plaster. I have done sheetrock installation, so I know about mud as a wet plaster. Yeah. There are also 2 different other kinds of mud, namely that fluid that is injected into the ground to crack the geological strata and release either gas or oil. And the lubricant that is used when drilling deep holes for oil is also called mud. The point of that extraneous information is that, at least to a significant extent, what constitutes anti-Semitism is significantly affected by the audience to which you are speaking. Anti-Semitism goes from the spectrum from Abe Foxman, who thinks that any criticism of any Jewish activity anywhere probably is anti-Semitism, and you'll meet Mr. Foxman later in this presentation, all the way over to the other side where Eustace Mullins, whom you have read somewhat about in terms of the Federal Reserve, and who was a close associate of Ezra Pound, Shukran, and in almost all of his political and economic dealings had negative experiences with Jews, either in the area of politics or economics. On the same side of the spectrum as Eustace Mullins is David Duke. And David Duke, unlike, I think, Mullins and the vast majority of even recognizable anti-Semites, David Duke thinks that there is a genetic abnormality in Jews, and that's what causes them to behave in the fashion that they do. David Duke is not much of a scientist, and what he talks about is fake science. And besides which, the genetic consistency of the Jewish tribe is all over the place. You've got 2 major Jewish tribes, and then you've got a multitude of minor Jewish tribes and intermarriages. So a genetic explanation, if there is a problem, just doesn't cut it. Excuse me. I'm so delighted to get the system working that I am now coughing. What constitutes anti-Semitism for Western media is largely determined by how the media bosses feel about it. Because virtually all of Western media is highly influenced by and or controlled by Jewish businessmen. I will refer later on in the presentation to an article by Joel Stein, the title of which is "Who Rules Hollywood? Come on." And Mr. Stein goes on to demonstrate that everyone in positions of authority in Hollywood are Jewish, or they're doing everything they can to keep their non-Jewishness private so as to not create hostility among their Jewish comrades. Jeremy Corbyn is the head of the British Labour Party right now and is being accused of anti-Semitism because he's trying to say something rational about the Middle East and something rational about the treatment of Palestinians. Gilad Atzmon, who is a former Jew, he's a political analyst and a blogger, has been sued for anti-Semitism, and the judicial system, this comment is about the media, but the judicial system is also rigged. In the nature of Mr. Atzmon's suit, he was accused of anti-Semitism, but in order to make sure the jury arrived at the correct interpretation, the judge read the article that Atzmon had written about the Jewish situation in Great Britain, and I'll give you the title in just a moment. And the judge, in order to make it clear what the correct verdict should be, said that Mr. Atzmon, if the jury were to find Mr. Atzmon guilty of anti-Semitism, that is because he was accusing his accuser of fraud. Now, the judge clearly was unwilling to let the jury arrive at the conclusion that the article was embracing fraud or accusing the accused of fraud. So the judge had to say, what you see here is the accusation that the Jew who was extracting funds was extracting funds fraudulently. So the judge basically made the situation so that there was no way Mr. Atzmon could win, because there was no way that he was going to have to defend himself against fraud. Not because he had committed the accused of fraud, but because his article required individual interpretation, and the judge deprived the jury of that privilege. So Atzmon is accused of anti-Semitism, and because he's politically important in Great Britain, because he is positively anti-Zionist. He has some very nasty things to say against Zionism, because he was a soldier in the Israeli army. He was with the Israeli army when the Israeli army entered Lebanon. He saw what the Israeli army was doing to their Arab captives, and he walked away not only from the Israeli army, but from his Judaism. That's how disgusted he was with it. But the point that I'm making with this slide is that the media, and in the one case, the judicial system, determines for you, the public, what is anti-Semitism. If you think that's getting the process upside down, you're absolutely correct. For me personally, anti-Semitism is the unwarranted hostility toward Jews or Jewish actions. Now that makes it a very narrow definition. And Mr. Foxman would certainly reject that definition. Eustace Mullins would probably be perfectly happy with it, because he sees the vast majority of Jewish actions as hostile. He just has some very unpleasant experiences. By that definition, the scope of true anti-Semitism is really quite small. Lies. Remember that earlier slide mentioned mud, lies, and streams. And I see a very clear parallel between the lies that American leadership have imposed on Americans and the lies that Jewish leadership have imposed on the Jewish tribe. Major difference is that the lies that have been imposed on the American people have been added, amplified, modified, and propagandized for 250 years. The lies that have been imposed on the Jewish tribe have been imposed on the tribe by their leadership for 10 times as long. The genocide of the Native Americans, the initially nascent, leading to overt imperialism in the United States, the reduction of human persons to human resources in the United States, and the destruction of individual sovereignty being replaced by national sovereignty in the United States, that's been going on for 250 years. The lies that have been perpetrated against the Jewish people derive from certain streams. Those streams are, you can call them philosophical perspectives, you can call them theological perspectives or emphases, but they derive from the Torah, which is the Jewish law, and the Tanakh, which is the Jewish Bible. Tanakh stands for Torah, Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim, the three parts of what Christians call the Old Testament, and the Torah is the law. Now, a brief excursus. In the theology, philosophy, and thinking of Talmudic Judaism, there are two expressions of the Jewish law. Christians know of one expression of the law. That is the law of Moses, that which you read in the book of Exodus and repeated a couple times in subsequent parts of the Old Testament. But which is very important for Talmudic Judaism, and you'll notice that I'm being careful with my phrasing, because there are multiple strains of Judaism. The one that is most obvious to the Western world is Talmudic Judaism, but there are multiple other strains that we'll talk about at least in short order. But the other form of the law for Talmudic Judaism is the Torah Sheba'al Peh. That's the oral law. In Jewish theology, God gave the law of Moses to Moses on Mount Sinai in written form. And Moses came down from the hill, from the mountain, with 10 tablets. This is the written law. The rabbis, however, have what I will call, which is not probably fairly said as such, but which I will call the secret law, the recited law, the memorized law that God delivered to Moses, and Moses subsequently delivered to subsequent generations of rabbis down through the last 3,000 years. Now, I'm going to be a bit cynical at that point and say, if you believe that, I have a bridge I would love to have you rent and or buy. But that is Talmudic Jewish theology, that the rabbis reflect the mind and law of God with their memorized oral law, which has some major advantages, actually, because for the Talmudic Jewish position is that there is no human question and or dilemma that is not answered by the Jewish law. Those of you who have seen some rendition of Fiddler on the Roof remember Tevye singing about posing problems that would cross a rabbi's eyes. In Talmudic Judaism, there is no such thing as a question or a problem that the law does not answer. I'm going to point out that this is very convenient for the rabbis or for the religious teachers, because for the millions of questions that the ordinary lay Jew does not have an answer to, they can and do and are responsible for so doing, looking to their rabbis for the official legitimate answer to this religious question. Sometimes it is abused. Sometimes it is used as a merely intellectual game. Many times it is not used as an intellectual game. The Jewish peasant has a legitimate question and he approaches his rabbi. There are hosts of books that act as compendia for the traditional Jewish law. They have a variety of names. You may or may not have heard the name of Maimonides, which is the Anglo version of Moses ben Maimon, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, Ramban, Rabbi Nathan ben, no, Rabbi Moses ben Natan is Ramban. These are the names of a few of the predominant religious leaders over the last 2,000 years who have written commentaries on the law, interpretations of the law, and the oral law is embodied, because I have to take you down at least a certain amount of history. And I'm going to be anticipating some of this, of what I'm going to present later. But the oral law started being collected when Ezra and Nehemiah led a number of people who would subsequently be called Jews back to Palestine from Babylon. They had gone into exile under when the king of Babylon had conquered Palestine, and when Babylon was conquered by the Persians, a small number of them were allowed to return. Ezra and Nehemiah led some of the captives back, and it was at that point in time when one of the several streams of Judaism became compressed into the Jews who came back to Palestine, and that's what became subsequently what you and I know as Judaism. The other strains, we'll talk about that in a little while, but a lot of theological perceptions that you find in the Old Testament, you do not find in Talmudic Judaism. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. The four main streams are found in the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. Some of the writers of those 5 books, because they were written by multiple different authors at several different points in time, some of them refer to God as with a proper name called Yahweh. In English, in King James, it's Jehovah. Others of those writers refer to God as El or Elohim. Elohim being the plural, and you can talk about El Elohim, or the God of gods. Referring, still in that context, referring to one supreme God. The other 2 major strains are called D and P. D standing for the theological perspective and the authorship of the book of Deuteronomy, and P referring to the priestly code, which declares the specifics of how a priest dresses, talks, eats, drinks, provides for him, the way a priest lives the entirety of his life, and the way the congregation deals with the law, deals with being right with the Jewish God. Both D and P are one frame of reference. That frame of reference has an answer for every human dilemma, and that frame of reference requires, now this was more or less frozen in time about 450 AD. The reason I picked that number is that's when those Hebrews that returned to Palestine were placed under the administrative control of Ezra and Nehemiah, in the process of which the Jews who had returned were instructed and forced to stop having any relations with the Palestinians who were still there, and were forced to abandon the wives that they had taken from the local Palestinian congregation. It's as if some prominent rabbi went to New York today. I'm intentionally picking New York because it has a lot of Jews in it, and it has a lot of social intercourse between Jews and Goys. And said, if you really want to be a Jew, you've got to practice your Judaism this way, and you've got to abandon your Gentile husband or your Gentile wife. Now that is what happened in Palestine in 458 BC. And you can get more information on this if you're interested in exploring it in the book by Douglas Reed called The Controversy of Zion. Covered that. The symbols JEDP refer not only to writers, but theological points of view. And D and P are the forerunners, J and E are reflected in what you know as most of the rest of the Old Testament. If you have Micah and Jeremiah and the vast majority of the prophets and most of the wisdom literature, they are talking about a God of mercy, as well as a God of justice. A God who embraces the nations, who knows Canaan, but also knows the Egyptians, and also knows the Ethiopians, and also knows this tribe over here and that tribe over there. D and P assert that the real God only knows Israel. If Americans are taught that America is the exceptional nation and the only essential nation, Jews are taught through the D and P documents that Jews are the only essential nation, and all of the rest of the nations will subsequently come to serve them. A very exclusivistic point of view. And it's a very hostile point of view towards the Goyim, or the nations. And as I indicated from Ezra and Nehemiah, that nation is required to be pure in a ritual sense, and it's required to be separated from the rest of the nations in the political, and to a large extent, but not exclusively, in an economic sense. The two streams of thought came to dominate the form of religion that survived from 450 BC to 0 BC to 1800 AD. Ezra and Nehemiah demanded religious purity as well as social purity, and something that the vast majority of Christians, including Christian scholars, didn't realize, that Rabbinic Judaism is not derived from the totality of the Old Testament. It is primarily derived from the book of Ezekiel, from the Deuteronomic and priestly codes, and Ezra and Nehemiah. In addition, there are at least two, because actually there are more, but there are at least two morality plays that are found in the Old Testament that are indicative of the way Jews are commanded by this understanding of religion to interact with Gentiles. Those two morality plays are the book of Esther and the book of Daniel. There are a couple other morality plays as well, but those two are clearly morality plays because Queen Esther never lived and the prophet Daniel never lived. I apologize for those of you who take the historicity of those books seriously, but from a scholastic point of view, they are morality plays. The book of Esther is interesting because it says that in Babylon, a substantial number of Babylonians became Jews because of the prominence of Queen Esther and the success that the Jews had in using non-Jews to achieve economic and political domination. Instead of being a small tribe of Jews in Babylon, they accumulating large number of Babylonian converts. And up until the domination of Christianity around 325, Judaism was a proselytizing cult. I'll call it a cult for a variety of reasons, because by 325, Judaism was still predominantly a religiously oriented community. Subsequently, it became dominated not only by religion, but by culture, by their political and economic organization. But up until 325, they were a separate community accumulating proselytes. Those of you who know your New Testament remember Jesus talking about the Pharisees who pound the bushes for a proselyte, and after they gain a proselyte, they make him twice the demonic person that the original Pharisees were. So Jesus had some very nasty things to say about rabbinic Judaism. It's this form of Talmudic Judaism, stemming from Ezra and Nehemiah, that was practiced in Jesus' time, and which he criticized very vigorously. The blood sacrifice aspect of Judaism disappeared when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, so that the Pharisaic school of Judaism, where all human problems can be solved by obedience to the law, and if you don't know the solution to the problem, you don't exercise. I want to point this out because it's very important from a psychological development point of view. If you have a quandary, the solution to that quandary is not applying your knowledge, your conscience, your knowledge of God to the problem and arriving at your solution. That's not the way you solve the problem. You solve the problem by going to the religious authority and asking that religious authority, here's my moral problem, how do I answer it? That continues to have the Jewish layperson dependent on the Jewish leadership for religious authority. It's great for keeping people in a childlike psychological perspective. Doug Reed, I think I mentioned this already, has done a good job. Doug Reed is not that much of a biblical scholar, but very wisely for this portion of his book entitled The Controversy of Zion, he read closely and carefully a very good Jewish scholar who was willing to say these things about Judaism. He's, in fact, the Jewish scholar that Doug was reading embraces the kind of rabbinic Judaism that I have been talking about. It creates a very closed community that is organized around a set of religious observances that made social intercourse with their neighbors, their non-Jews, almost impossible. You know, the Old Testament says to not boil the infant lamb in its mother's milk. From that simple prescription, probably dating to some Canaanitish religious practice, the rabbis have said, not only will you not cook any meat together with any milk, but you'll even have a set of pans that are used exclusively for meat and a set of pans that are used exclusively for milk products. Imagine trying to go to a restaurant and having a meal with a party from the other, a person from the other party. Some of you may have seen the movie Chariots of Fire, and one of the two main characters in that movie was Jewish, and he sat down with the girl that he was dating, and she ordered for them. She ordered pork chops. Created a nicely embarrassing scene for the movie, but it made what you and I would consider normal social interaction essentially impossible. wealthy Jews and religious Jews were the leadership of the Jewish communities from the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD until really the French Revolution. The French Revolution opened up European communities, especially Western European communities, and by that time the European communities that had already immigrated to the United States opened it up to a lot more social interaction between Goyim and Jews. But until then, you're talking about traveling on different sides of the road. And what you know about the other side of the road is what has been told you by your leadership. The form of interaction led to a fairly specific mode of interaction with the Jew and non-Jew, and it's summarized, and the interaction is almost exclusively commercial. Partly because Jews became dominant in the banking industry, and partly because the communities per se were largely closed one from the other. So the only occasion this closed community had to do with this closed community is when person A over here had a service to provide that person B over here needed. And that's when they had interaction one with another. It has been a popular question to ask whether Shakespeare was anti-Semitic when he wrote The Merchant of Venice. The more I learn about their interaction in the Middle Ages, Shakespeare was just accurately describing how commercial intercourse took place in a situation of hostility. And Shylock hated the guts of the person who had borrowed money from him. One intellectual in the material that I've been reading summarizes the rabbinic position as the Jew is responsible for treating the Gentile the way Gentiles treat other Gentiles. He's responsible to treat the Goy as the Goy treats another Goy. Now, that's very interesting because the subsequent lessons that we are told are derived from this principle means that if the Jew sees a Gentile lose some money, he is free to pick it up and not give it back to him. If, in a commercial transaction, the Jew is in a position to defraud his Gentile opposition, and free to do it without being caught, that's important. He's free to do it. If he sees a Gentile drowning in the river, and nobody is around, depending on the scholar you ask, he's either required to or allowed to let the Gentile drown, based on the idea that the Gentile implicitly is the enemy of the Jew. So if you can treat him badly and not bring shame on the Jewish community, you are A, allowed to, or B, must treat him badly. Now, you'll notice that I specified not be caught. Because one of the things that Maimonides makes very clear, if you're going to be nasty to a Gentile, you must do it in such a fashion that you do not bring disrespect and or punishment onto the Jewish community. Remember, the Jews were living as minorities in the vast majority of places where they lived. So if you do something that is going to impact negatively on the Jewish community, make darn sure that you don't get caught. And if you're going to get caught, do it. And Maimonides was the court physician to the Caliph in Egypt. So we're not talking about a guy who had no awareness of the interactions between non-Jews and Jews. He took care of the Caliph for decades. And as long as he took care of the Caliph and did so in a fashion that was responsible to the Caliph and did not bring shame to the Jewish community, he was doing his job as a responsible Jewish physician. Now, I would consider that reprehensible, and I think most of the people in the room would. I want to point out that this, the scholastic that I read attempts to say that this is the way goyim treat goyim, especially when you're talking about commercial matters. The writer is assuming that caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, is the routine practice when Gentiles deal with Gentiles. Well, if you talk about Islamic Spain, or you talk about Islamic Egypt, or Islamic Iraq, or Christian France, or Christian Great Britain, it's not. I don't know whether this scholastic is creating a straw man, or whether he is assuming that these other non-Jewish communities had no moral standards of their own. I don't know. I suspect that he's writing for a Jewish leader, a Jewish readership, and to the Jewish readership who's ignorant of Christian or Islamic culture is going to say, okay, this is the way Gentiles treat one another, so why not? I don't know. But I will tell you that there's a great deal of misinformation. Fortunately, there are other strains even within rabbinic tradition, and those strains from time to time come out. You may have seen the movie Schindler's List. In the movie Schindler's List, the Jewish headman presents a ring to Oskar Schindler that is inscribed in the inside of the ring a quotation from the Talmud. The quotation says that he who saves one life, it's as if he saves the entire world. Now, that is the reading in one of the two Talmudim. It is the reading that appears in the Jerusalem or Palestinian Talmud. For better and or for worse, the Talmud that is claimed by Jewish scholars to be the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law of God, is the Babylonian Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud acts as kind of a commentary or an adjunct or an appendix, an interesting book to read along with the oral word of God. But the oral word of God is the Babylonian Talmud. The reason that's interesting is that that very same text is quoted on a public building outside of Jerusalem today. It's quoted on a public building on Mount Zion, which is immediately to the southwest of the walled city of Jerusalem. The English translation of that text is, "He who saves one child, it's as if he saved the entire world." Unfortunately, that's the way any French person or English person or German person who knows English or American would read it. The person who reads Hebrew will read, "He who saves one of the sons of Israel," it's as if he saved the entire world. Echad b'nei Israel. The face that the Talmudic Judaism shows to the insider is he who saves one Jew, it's as if he saves the entire world. The face that the Talmudic Judaism shows to the non-Jewish world, he who saves one life, it's as if he saved the entire world. There is the implicit approval of deception in Talmudic Judaism. Oddly enough, some Jews have accused that acceptance of deception have accused Muslims of it, and under extreme circumstances, they are right. But it is remarkably extreme circumstances where the correctness of that observation applies. There are a host of situations where Jews that I have known don't deceive one another and didn't deceive me. I want to emphasize that because the Talmudic Jewish theology permits deception, but the vast majority of practicing Jews don't practice it. And I'm glad for that, because we'll get to some people later. Those who do not practice deception or manipulation of Goyim are Stan M., Howard Z., Braha S., Michael S., Marshall L., an airport security person about whom I will tell you. All of these are people with whom I've had very close contact over the decades. They're good people. If they told me that the sun was going to rise in the west, I take them very seriously. I'm not sure I believe them, but I take them very seriously. They're the salt of the earth. The airport security agent is worth saying about. When I was volunteering in Palestine as an anesthesiologist, I was routinely screened and harassed and given all kinds of hell by the airport security. I expected it. They had my ticket stamped one time with 4 big red S's, and they didn't stand for Superman, they stood for security. And because they had delayed me something like 2 hours, which was really modest, I was probably grumping when one of the security agents escorted me, hand in hand almost, hand on arm, escorted me through the rest of security. And I made some comment about this is the treatment you get when you help Palestinians. And this individual, out of hearing of the comrades, said, "We don't have a problem with Palestinians. We have a problem with our political leadership." That person didn't practice rabbinic Judaism. That individual is the kind of individual I'd like to have for coffee and talk with. Okay? As I say, the vast majority of people, of Jewish people, are not treating Gentiles this way. It is, however, very significant that when dealing in a Zionist situation, as that security agent was, the rules, they won't necessarily follow the rules, but the powers that be in the Zionist situation apply a different set of standards. Now, those who do practice it that way, settler number 1 greeted myself and some of my fellow laborers outside of the city of Hebron in the south part of the occupied territory. And in a subsequent discussion, because he basically accosted us, I told him, "Today, you are the terrorist." And he replied in perfect Brooklynese, "Fuck you." Okay? And he subsequently slugged my Palestinian nurse who was standing next to me. I didn't have the presence of mind to stand between them. I apologize for that. A similar mindset of insider-outsider was an American with whose wife I was visiting in the Tel Aviv airport on another travel occasion, and I shared with the two of them that I was there serving Palestinians as a physician. And the male of that pair basically went ballistic. He went nuts. If his wife hadn't been between us, I think, although he would have been sorry for doing it, I think he would have physically accosted me. I maintained most of my composure, and I told him that he was making about 1,600 assumptions. But that didn't calm him down, and he didn't stop yelling until his wife had gotten him about 50 feet away. His mindset was such that he, speaking for the Jewish tribe, found me to be the quintessential enemy and outsider. He was wrong, but there was no changing his mind. Okay? There are, unfortunately, a significant number of wealthy Jews, wealthy American Jews, whose loyalty is with Israel rather than the United States. And more than one of them have said, I don't want my sons to serve in the American army, but I'm happy if he serves in the Israeli army. Two of the wealthiest Jews, wealthiest American Jews, are one-issue people, and that issue is Israel. So I'm assuming that money talks, those two individuals use it to scream support for Israel. Remember, I defined anti-Semitism as unwarranted hostility to Jewish activities or Jewish persons. And frankly, I don't think my anger at those two Jewish billionaires is unwarranted. They are perverting American politics by injecting Zionist politics into it. The crucial divider, which is obvious to everyone here, but is curiously not obvious to the vast majority of the American people, is Zionism. The Zionist Jews even have to come up with a special term for the anti-Zionist Jews. They can call me anti-Semitic. How do they call an anti-Zionist Jew? An anti-Semite? Kind of silly. They come up with the term self-hating Jew. This is one of the self-hating Jews.
Our next speaker will be Judith Wiseman. So Judith Wiseman is a Toronto psychotherapist, a member of Independent Jewish Voices, and a founding member of Not in Our Name, Jews for a Just Peace, and the Jewish Women's Committee to End the Occupation of Palestine. Judith.
Thank you. I think really everything that's important has already been said, except for one thing. And that is, this didn't just start when Israel began to invade or began to bomb Gaza. This didn't just start when Israel invaded Lebanon. This didn't just start when Israel invaded the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights. It started, and it didn't just start in 1948, when Israel ethnically cleansed over 700,000 Palestinians from their own homes and homeland, and killed many of them in the process. It started at least in 1897. And what started it was the virus and the horror that I now consider of Zionism. Zionism is the scourge of the Jewish people. It is Zionism which has created all of this. It is the Zionists who have, with their nationalism and with their rejection of all that is good within Judaism, which has created a horror in this world. Now, I came today, actually my arm had to be twisted because I have not been that well, but I had to speak out once again. I had to say what is in my heart, because I, a Jew and a former Zionist, was a committed Zionist and wanted to live my life in Israel as a supporter of Israel. to live in a kibbutz where I would live on the land of another people, not knowing and not understanding what it was about. And it took me many years to really, for the scales literally to fall off of my eyes and to see what Israel has wrought among the Palestinians and the influence that Israel now has around the world and the power that Israel and the United States together are using to control so much of what is happening.
Raised me to love Israel unconditionally and uncritically. So when I grew up and I started discovering the stories of ethnic cleansing and colonization of Palestine that was involved in the creation of the state of Israel that had been hidden from me, my community, my family, my parents threatened to disown me, to push me out, accuse me of supporting terrorism. But the amazing thing is that as my mother started listening to the stories of injustice and oppression in Palestine that I started bringing home, she started to ask her own questions of these positions her community was taking. And a couple of years ago, when she was living in Jerusalem and I was working in Dheisheh refugee camp, she agreed to cross through the Israeli military checkpoint and visit the camp. At the end of the tour that my friend took her on throughout the camp, my mother stopped and she started crying. And as I was hugging her, she said, "I'm so sorry, Aura. I raised you wrong. I was ignorant. I didn't know." And it was so powerful for me that here is this woman in her mid-50s, the wife of a rabbi, a major figure in the Jewish community, who was willing to open up her head and heart and listen to Palestinian voices and admit that she was wrong.
Ora Weiss subsequently has moved to the United States, and I think it's because the hostility of the Zionist Israelis in Israel probably got to be too much for her. A few more, and I'm going to interrupt them because I want you to see what Abe Foxman is calling anti or self-hating Jews.
It's a great pleasure to be here and to meet many of my longtime readers in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, with which I have been associated, it seems like, for decades. Now, we all know that Zionism has distorted American policy in the Middle East. At the same time, it has had a terribly negative impact upon Jewish life in the United States and throughout the world. And it is important to remember that historically, Zionism was a minority view within Judaism, particularly in America. The organization whose journal I edit, the American Council for Judaism, was established in 1942. And it was established primarily because the established Jewish organizations, which had previously opposed the concept of Jewish nationalism, had changed course. So the council was organized to maintain this older view that first, Judaism is a religion, not a nationality, that American Jews are American by nationality and Jews by religion, just as other people are Protestant, Catholic, or Muslim. This was the view maintained by the vast majority of American Jews all through history. In my opinion, it's the view of the silent majority today. Zionism gained a foothold largely because of the reaction to Nazism. Something had to be done in the wake of the horror of Europe. But
the anti-Zionist Jewish community, they're there. They see Braunfeld is a great example of the intellectual leadership of the next clip is of both Norm Finkelstein, who is a vigorous opponent of Zionism, and Abe Foxman, who's a vigorous advocate of it. I'll let them speak for themselves. The video from which this clip is taken is called Hashmatzah, and if you get IMDb, it's a commercial internet movie agency, you can get it. This is called Hashmatzah. It's made by a Jewish Israeli with the honesty to ask good questions.
Dr. Finkelstein, you have some visitors?
Professor Norman Finkelstein, a Jewish academic from DePaul University in Chicago, has written a book called The Holocaust Industry, in which he accuses parts of the Jewish establishment of making cynical political use of the Holocaust.
Dr. Finkelstein, you have some visitors?
Whenever Israel faces a public relations debacle or comes under pressure to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict, they start up this extravaganza called the new anti-Semitism. As it's usually understood, anti-Semitism means an irrational hatred of Jews, born simply of the fact that they are Jewish. But that's not what's going on. Here it's a hostility born of the fact that the state which claims to represent them is engaged in quite brutal violence. I'm sure lots of people I meet have this, what you say, deep down inside, they have this kind of queasy feeling about Jews. I'm sure that's true. But did it have any real substantial repercussions on me in life? The answer is just no. There's a kind of pathological narcissism, navel contemplation. When you are the richest, wealthiest, most successful ethnic group in the United States, you've got the world on a platter, and you sit around and you're talking about anti-Semitism. It's just kind of shameful, I think.
At the time I first interviewed Finkelstein, I didn't realize what a controversial figure he was in the eyes of the Jewish establishment. Finkelstein, the son of Holocaust survivors, has been labeled a self-hating Jew, a Holocaust denier, and a madman. I had interviews stopped at the very mention of his name.
I know if you Google Norman Finkelstein and Holocaust denier, nowadays you'll get about 10,000 websites. Well, if I'm a Holocaust denier, I would have to be certifiably insane. I would have to be clinically insane. Because, given who my parents were, for me to be denying the Nazi Holocaust, I'd have to be clinically insane. So you have to judge for yourself. You may disagree with me, but is it your impression that I'm clinically insane? Now, if you think I'm not, then you have to wonder, why are those 10,000 websites saying that?
Recently, there's this talk about the new anti-Semitism, which is very related to Israel. And I've been heard that from Jews outside of Israel, saying Israel is the cause that anti-Semitism is now, that we are suffering from anti-Semitism.
Well, I would say that is nonsense. That comes from insecure Jews. I think people use Israel as an excuse to rationalize and legitimize, because in many places of the world, anti-Semitism is not acceptable. It's not polite, it's not proper. But if you can camouflage it, if you can find a platform of a news event, of a political discourse, then you use it. And we find every time there is conflict in the Middle East between Israel and somebody else, the level of anti-Semitism spikes. Why? Because the anti-Semites come out of their woodwork, and now they can express themselves in their anti-Semitism in what they consider a legitimate, licensed way.
Strangely enough, Foxman and Finkelstein agreed on one thing, which is that most anti-Semitic incidents nowadays fall under the category of new anti-Semitism. The difference is that Foxman says that anti-Semites found a new target called Israel, to which they could express their anti-Semitism. While Finkelstein believes that saying that is a cynical misuse of the term anti-Semitism. But attacks on the ADL seem to be coming from all directions.
So today in America, there are two professors who are saying that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to America. Mearsheimer and Wald. See, this is what Mearsheimer and Wald. Mearsheimer and Wald.
By their actions, substantially more loyal to the United States than they are, more loyal to Israel than they are to the United States. It does take a little digging because it is politically incorrect to be more loyal to Israel than to the United States. But if you look at actions, i.e. where your sons serve in the military, i.e. where your charitable contributions go, it's not a hard case to make whatsoever. A couple examples of Jewish behavior that is consistent with the mode of interaction suggested by Talmudic Judaism.
שלום, הגעתי בתוכנית ההיסטוריה של טופי והגורילה. ובה נדבר על מאורעות מרכזיים בקורות העם היהודי, מאז ועד היום. היום נלמד על צליבת ישו. שמעת על ישו? הוא נשמע אדם נחמד. לא. ישו היה אויב העם היהודי. הוא ניסה להפוך את כולנו לנוצרים. אף שישנם נוצרים טובים, היהדות היא סכנה נוראית, המאיימת על שלום העם היהודי. אני רוצה להתבולל! אתה יודע לך מה זה להתבולל? זה לקיים יחסי מין עם גויה. זה לא דבר שלא אני ולא אתה רוצים כמובן. אני רוצה שהילדים שלי יאכלו תבלחות ויהיו גויים. משעמם לי כאן, טופי. אני רוצה לגור בשוויץ עם גויה ולאכול תבלחות כל היום. טוב, שוקית, אם אתה כל כך אוהב את ישו, אז אתה תשחק את ישו. אני הוא יהודה אשכולות. ואני ישו. אני רוצה שכולכם תהפכו לנוצרים, תאכלו חזיר וטבלון, ויהיה לכם כיף. אתם רוצים מצותים בבית? בגלל זה אני אצלול אותך. איך אתה מעז להטיף ליהודים התמימים? אלוהים! למה עזבתני? אתה נאצי ישו, אתה נאצי. טופי, לא, טופי, אני מפחד. אני הלכתי על המים, אני הפכתי צרצרים לעוגה. לא, אני לא ישו. זו טעות, אני משה רבנו. אל תתני לי מסמרים, טופי, לא. זה רק הפרק, מחדל. לא! או, טופי, או, אלוהים, לא!
That's a TV channel in Israel. It's a government-sponsored channel. And I'll just let the video speak for itself. I don't know if you want to call it anti-Christian, anti-civil, whatever.
הדיונים האלה ייכנסו לאוזניים וללבבות המתאימים, ומה שהיה כאן, נקווה שזה חלף.
I'm stopping that because you cannot read it and it makes little sense. But it's a conference that was held at a hotel in Jerusalem to discuss the legitimacy and the importance of supporting the book that is under discussion. The name of the book is Torah HaMelech, and it's an academic exercise in exploration of the oral law as to when and under what circumstances it is legitimate to kill non-Jews. And if, in the more extreme interpretations, if you expect for example, an Arab child to grow up to be an enemy of the Jewish people, you are, according to this legalistic understanding, you are entitled to kill him while he or she is still a child. It's a very legalistic understanding. Remember, the law answers all problems. People become responsible for acting upon the law, not coming to understand and or exercise individual responsibility. I apologize for your inability to read it. And again, there are there are rabbis as well as laypersons outside the door objecting to this conference because they see the inhumanity of the exercise that is being described here. So this is one wing, and it's a fairly extreme wing. It's absolutely, totally extreme in terms of the Judaism that I encountered when I lived there. But it's much more, I don't want to call it mainstream, but it certainly is much more defended and defensible in 2018 than it was in 1967. Yeah, this is worth watching.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. Some people might think that Mr. Roosevelt wanted to get us into World War II, as David mentioned. You may recall we had to wait for Pearl Harbor. Some people might think Mr. Wilson wanted to get us into World War I. You may recall he had to wait for the Lusitania episode. Some people might think that Mr. Johnson wanted to send troops to Vietnam. You may recall he had to wait for the Gulf of Tonkin episode. We didn't go to war with Spain until the until the Maine exploded. And may I point out that Mr. Lincoln did not feel he could call out the Federal Army until Fort Sumter was attacked, which is why he ordered the commander at Fort Sumter to do exactly that thing which the South Carolinians had said would cause an attack. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that, but I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. It's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
As I say, subterfuge and deception are perfectly allowed. The script is a little smaller, but the interactions that was suggested by the previous speaker are perfectly consistent with the Talmudic suggestions. What is anti-Semitism in the light of these demonstrations? And when does the behavior warrant hostility? That's the key question. Can we get this bigger? Let's see. This is a picture of, let's see if I can, Adelson is on his right and Chaim Saban is on his left. Both very wealthy Republican contributors. Wealthy Jewish contributors. And Graham is commenting about he might be the first one to have a totally Jewish cabinet. Just think, he can compete with Benjamin Netanyahu. Pandering for Jewish money were exceptional, I wouldn't even bother mentioning it. It's the very fact that it is normal in American politics and in the American media that requires my calling attention to it. Gilad Atzmon, whom I mentioned earlier, has made the very succinct statement that Jewish power in the West is the ability to silence discussion of Jewish power. In the Western press, anti-Semitism is what the controllers of the Western press say it is. Yeah. Lindsey Graham is the guy in the center. Sheldon Stein has said, he wrote the article, Who Controls Hollywood? Come on. His naivete about publishing it is unfortunate, because the one thing Joel Stein should have known as a Jewish journalist was that you can rejoice in Jewish power so long as you don't let that rejoicing out to the non-Jewish community. And that's why he lost his job, and I'm virtually certain. He was fired from the newspaper that he was writing for at the time, because you don't boast to the people who are being oppressed. Hannah Arendt suggested to the Jewish leadership that they contributed to the Jewish Holocaust, and she was right. The Jewish leadership had taught the Jewish people to be obedient to the authorities. So they got in line when they were told to get in line, and they climbed on the railroad cars when they were told to get on the railroad. Now, in terms of the Holocaust, it depends on what you mean by it as to whether it actually happened or not. But in terms of contributing to the Jewish suffering, the Jewish leadership clearly did. Starting with the French Revolution, there have been major attacks on, not Jews, but on the Jewish sense of isolationism. Now, as a way of winding this up, because it's gone substantially longer than I thought it would, George Herbert Walker Bush and George Baker in 1991 intentionally deceived Mikhail Gorbachev. They wanted to recombine East and West Germany. And Gorbachev was legitimately concerned about what NATO was going to do if he let Eastern Germany combine with Western Germany. And George Herbert Walker Bush and George Baker solemnly promised NATO won't take 1 inch further east. In private, George Herbert Walker Bush told Helmut Kohl, "To hell with that, we prevailed." They didn't. And NATO subsequently is now trying to absorb the Ukraine. The behavior that is consistent with Talmudic prescription, that behavior is consistent with Talmudic prescription, and any time that behavior is manifested, the behavior done by a Jewish person or a Gentile person deserves condemnation. This cartoon depicts Benjamin Netanyahu saying next year in Jerusalem, when an Israeli performer won some European honor. This was sufficiently, quote, anti-Semitic, unquote, so that the cartoonist lost his job. So, if you want to keep your job, be careful what you say and to whom you say it. But you know what? I'm retired. Program over. Anti-Semitism does exist in some remote corners of the world. But it's anti-Zionism that's creating a lot of hostility. Questions or comments? Was it news to you?
Well, there were some things that were very interesting I'm thinking about.
Okay.
I was curious how you did say you thought Daniel and Esther were not...
They're morality plays.
Yeah.
And you didn't walk out of the room. Catherine, you didn't walk out of the room. That is to your credit, because I know that violates a certain portion of your real world, and I apologize to that. I was not treating it flippantly.
Yeah, no, I was just curious. You'll have to email me what your basis is for saying that. I'd be curious.
First and foremost, we have very good records of Babylonian and Persian history of that time period. and no account of the Mordecai Esther thing appears in it.
Oh, okay. There's no other,
Yeah.
okay.
And if you look, in terms of Daniel, if you look at what Daniel and the three young men are instructed to do, they are being oppressed precisely by the kind of behavior that the Seleucid kings were imposing on Palestinian Jews around 170 BC. In other words, you look at what the three men and Daniel were being instructed as faithful Jews to do was precisely the challenge that was being faced by faithful Jews of Palestine in 170 BC. So, it fits as a morality play saying, this is what your forefathers did, this is what you ought to do as well.
And I think you were talking about a variety of Jewish thought about what it is to be a Jew in the United States. I mean,
that deserves a little comment. Just what it means to be a Jew in the West. And you always run into this question, what is a Jew? Is Judaism a religion? Is it an ethnicity? Is it a race?
custom.
Is it a set of customs? And Gilad Atzmon, I think, has hit upon the best explanation. In the 21st century, Judaism is a tribe. Sammy Davis Jr. joined the tribe. Elizabeth Taylor joined the tribe. Gilad Atzmon walked away from the tribe. If you look at tribalism in the early United States, any number of escaped black slaves and a few captured white women and a few captured white men joined the tribe that had taken them captive. And no small number of them chose not to return to white society. They had become tribal members. They considered their identity was part of the tribe. Atzmon says there are, quote, 3 types of Jews. And he's done a lot of good thinking about it. There's the religious Jew, who practices some form of the Jewish religion. That individual is not a problem politically, economically, or any other way. No more than a Muslim is, no more than a Christian is, no more than a Buddhist is. Okay? There is the Jew that considers himself part of the tribe, but also considers himself part of the tribe of Americans, might also consider himself the tribe of the Moose, might also consider himself the tribe of the Chamber of Commerce. That individual, in fact, I wanted to call attention to a couple of these individuals. Judith Weissman is a great example of a Jewess who knows who she is. She knows who she is as a separate, individual, autonomous human being. And if you ever pinned her down, she would say, first and foremost, I am a human being. Secondly, I'm a Jew. Thirdly, I'm an American, or in her case, Canadian. No, probably secondly, she'd be a female human being. She would be a member of the human race, and she would be female, because that is a distinct category in our time. She's an autonomous human being. The third kind of individual in Gilad Atzmon's patterning is the Jew whose identity is wrapped up in his or her Judaism. That is at the core of their being who they are. At the core of your being, you're very close to being a Christian, which I understand and respect, which is why what I said about Daniel and Esther was so troubling, and I respect that. I want you to know, I said it because I believe it is so close to what I'm trying to present as the truth. But I said it with some respect for the difficulty I would create for you. Where individual people have achieved individuation, and I think everyone in this room has individuated themselves so that they know who they are, independent of their membership in this group, membership in that group, membership in that group. The Jew that has a real problem is where his identity is caught up in his Judaism, so that he's at the mercy of somebody else telling him, what does a good Jew do? Well, from the point of view of Abe Foxman, a good Jew is a Zionist Jew. And if you're not a Zionist Jew, you're a self-hating Jew. Individuation is discouraged in the Jewish community. Unfortunately, it's discouraged in the American community. Children in school nowadays are not taught to become individuals. They are taught to follow the crowd. If I'm lying, I'm dying.
This woman judge that everyone is saying, she's so wonderful, I mean, I don't know who's saying this. What's her name,
Anna von Rice.
No, the Supreme Court Justice.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What's her name?
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah. I mean, everyone's like, and have pictures of her on their walls and everything. Does anyone know anything about her background, how she's voted on things? Is she voting pro-Jewish? Is she pro-Israel? What's...
Since 1960, and this includes the judgeship of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court has sided with the Zionist or Jewish point of view very consistently since about 1965. There are now 3 serving Jews, so that the Jews represent 33% of the judges on the Supreme Court. If you look at the collection of students that are seriously considered for Harvard, and the percentage of Jews that are in that group, the Jewish population is overrepresented by a factor of 4 in that group of already pre-selected. We're not talking about whether you're semi-bright or bright. That's already been included. You're talking about all of the bright kids that have the real possibility of getting admitted to Harvard. In fact, the Oriental students either are or are contemplating suing Harvard because the Oriental students are underrepresented by about a factor of 0.6. There are about 40% fewer Chinese Oriental students in that select group, as there should be. There are 4 times as many Jewish persons. As an example of the kind of preference that is granted, Anthony Sutton had a list of prominent people who, in his studies, saw that they were in key positions to serve a fairly specific goal of the round table, the English round table, or consider it the Council of Foreign Relations. It's not, but for the purposes of my illustration, call it some group like the CFR. There was something that bound these 40 people together, and he couldn't figure out what that commonality was. They'd all gone to Yale, but that wasn't enough. The commonality was much too integrated to say it was all, they're all Yale undergraduates. Charlotte Iserbit, her husband happens to be a member of the Skull and Bones. Not currently active according to her words, but who knows. And she gave Tony Sutton the registry of all of the members of Skull and Bones. And Sutton said, that's it. All of these 40 people had greased the skids in one way or another for one another to achieve the positions of power that they had achieved. Okay? You're talking about the sharing of influence by members of the Skull and Bones. I would submit that whether you're talking about the Skull and Bones or the CFR or American Jews, that tendency to provide preference for the member of the group over against an equally qualified non-member of the group applies everywhere, unfortunately. Well, if you're a member of the group, it's fortunately. If you're an outsider, it's unfortunately. I went to Illinois Tech, so I didn't have a chance from the start.
Well, Jewish, unlike Christians, have a ethnic component to it, a national, Christians are all sorts of ethnicities. So as you say, some people see themselves Jewish by blood. But like Elizabeth Taylor, some people become Jewish because they embrace the Jewish religion, including the God of the Old Testament. So I guess what I'm saying is, what is Jewish? If you, in the purest sense, you would say, to me, you would say the Jewish person is a person who embraces the teachings of the Jewish faith and the Jewish God. However, there are people, just like in all religions, who might say, yeah, I'm a Christian or I'm a Catholic, but I go on Easter and Christmas and I'm not really into that.
The reason I like Gilad Atzmon's bottom line of calling it a tribe is that there are atheists in the Jewish tribe, and there are observers of the Jewish religion in the Jewish tribe, and there are several versions of the Jewish religion in the Jewish tribe. There are several ethnicities, two major ones, but multiple minor ethnicities in the Jewish tribe. But tribalism, as a sociologic entity, is a tightly knit group into which you are born or admitted, and from which you can leave voluntarily or by expulsion. Hannah Arendt was virtually expelled from the Jewish tribe.
Would you say the majority of those people that are in the tribe would accept someone like Elizabeth Taylor?
It depends. That's an excellent question, because there are multiple streams, even depending on the tradition they embrace. For example, the secular Jews of Hollywood would have no trouble embracing Sammy Davis Jr. and Elizabeth Taylor. The Orthodox Jews of New York almost certainly would not. And the Orthodox rabbis of Israel would probably would reject conservative and Reformed American Jews. They would probably be permitted to emigrate to Israel. They would not be allowed to marry another Jew in Israel. It gets really sticky when you're talking about the rigid enforcement of Talmudic Judaism, which the rabbis of Israel are trying to impose. Young secular Jews of Israel today have to go to Cyprus or Greece in order to get married. So much for tribal loyalty. But that is a religious political dilemma that the Israeli leadership made long ago. They made a devil's pact, as it were, with the Orthodox Jewish leadership, because they needed that 2 or 3% to form political alliances. I don't think there's ever been an Israeli cabinet that didn't have an official rabbi over the religious party. You guys have been very attentive today, thank you. And it's taken me way too long.